Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the WIVEC Town Hall on the January 6th insurrection and the congressional hearings that followed. This is our second town hall on this topic because the topic keeps growing and growing and becoming more vast, and Wisconsin certainly played a large role at the end of the hearings. I'd like to thank everyone for coming and taking time out of your busy Thursday and your lunch hour. And we know a lot of people did register for this, knowing that they'd have to do this, listen to this on recording. So we appreciate everyone who is going to listen to this later on in recording. I'd like to say it's great to see a lot of faces of people whose names I email often. It's nice to connect a face to those names. So thank you for coming on today. Again, this is a webinar on the January 6th insurrection and the town and the congressional hearings that followed. And I'd like to thank Mel Barnes for joining us. And in just a moment, we will start. But for now, I'm going to have Peter Bakken give a little description of WIVEC and what we have going on these days.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. Yes, I'm Peter Bakken. I'm the Justice and Witness Coordinator for the Wisconsin Council of Churches. And together with Rabbi Bonnie Margulis, who is the Executive Director of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, I'm the co-lead for the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign. We're partnering on this nonpartisan campaign to promote civic engagement in Wisconsin and also to build bridges between faith communities and other organizations through collaboration for the common good. We provide a weekly email of news about elections, voting, voter rights, and volunteer opportunities. And just to briefly mention a couple of the projects that we've got coming up this fall, one of them we're calling Pray with Your Feet, Pray with Your Vote, which is an effort to send teams of folks from different congregations or different faith traditions to low propensity voter areas for nonpartisan voter education and voter engagement, encourage people to register and to vote. And we did a pilot of that this past spring. We're looking to expand it to a number of other areas in Wisconsin. And another project that we're doing is recruiting poll chaplains who would provide a welcoming and a peaceful presence at polling places in the November election. This is also something that we did last time around, and particularly we found that poll workers found it very supportive and encouraging and reassuring to have that kind of a presence, and we think voters did as well. If you'd be interested in participating in either of these, I am putting in the chat links for you to sign up so that you can learn more about it, about them. And just to say in general, by engaging the interfaith community in the democratic process, we believe we can build increased understanding and stronger ties among different faith communities, increase engagement in the electoral process, and promote a greater understanding by faith communities of the influential role they can play in the public square. Another thing that we do is to seek to educate the public about the integrity of our electoral processes and how to counter efforts that try to undermine it through disinformation, anti-voter legislation, and even outright violence. And that brings us to today's webinar, and I'll turn it over to Rabbi Bonnie to introduce the topic and our speaker.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce you to Mel Barnes, and really grateful to Mel for taking the time to be with us today. As I was reminding her, we first met when she was in law school. As I was chair and am still chair of the Wisconsin Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and Mel was the president of Law Students for Choice. And so we met doing reproductive justice work together. And since then, Mel has really spent her whole career at the intersection of law and advocacy. She joined Law Forward, where she currently works, from Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin, where she was the director of legal advocacy and policy, leading litigation, lobbying, and grassroots initiatives to advance access to healthcare across the state. In that role, she oversaw development of a groundbreaking case challenging the constitutionality of 3 Wisconsin laws restricting access to reproductive health care. Mel has worked on political campaigns with the state legislature and with 2 administrations on a broad set of issues impacting women and families. She graduated with honors from the University of Wisconsin Law School, where she worked with the Wisconsin Innocence Project. And Mel would like us to know that she's spent over a decade working in coffee shops, and her favorite weekend spot is Mirror Lake State Park. Law Forward recently had a very important victory that I hope Mel will also give us a few words on, in addition to talking about the January 6th hearing. And I'm going to turn it over to Mel now.
Excellent. Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, everyone, for having me today. I really appreciate getting to talk with all of you about this really interesting topic that I certainly enjoy spending time thinking about and learning about. I really want our conversation to be relatively informal today, and I want to just be in conversation with you about things that you think are interesting. So I will start by sharing a little bit about Law Forward, a little bit about my kind of broader thoughts on what we've seen from the January 6th hearings and what I think the future might hold. And then I'll transition briefly into kind of tying things back to Wisconsin and really, speaking to why I think the January 6th hearings and the related investigations are particularly relevant for our state, including because of a lawsuit that Law Forward filed in May that seeks to hold some of our homegrown bad actors here in Wisconsin accountable for some of these attempts to undermine our democracy. So I will go through those very briefly. And then, like I said, I really want to leave lots of time for questions and just open this up to a broader conversation. So as Bonnie mentioned, I am now an attorney at Law Forward. We're a relatively new organization. We launched in October of 2020, and we're really focused on advancing and protecting democracy here in Wisconsin. So we are totally state-based and focused, and we started the organization because we saw a gap in the tremendous and important legal work and advocacy work that was happening in our state. And we realized that we really needed a legal organization that was focused on being pro-democracy and pro-good government across a wide array of issues that I think all of us here on staff really care about. As Bonnie mentioned, we met from my reproductive rights work, and that's something that is still so important to me and care about a lot and been active in, especially with everything that's been going on this year. But I'm here doing this job, and we launched Law Forward because we see our democracy as the bedrock that all of these other important fights really grow from, and we need this firm footing here in our state. So our organization has grown quickly because there's been so much going on with democracy in Wisconsin. We now have 5 full-time lawyers, including our executive director, and we recently hired a operations and communications assistant. So we are really excited to be digging into this work in Wisconsin and investing in the long term of making sure that we can fight the fights that we all care about in our state through the channels of a functioning government, including making sure everyone has access to the ballot and that government is working to serve the people. So that's Law Forward, and I'm happy to chat a little bit about the voting rights case that Bonnie mentioned, or anything else that we've been working on as well, and look forward to engaging with all of you about that. But let's start with the January 6th committee hearings, which is why we're all here today. So I want to start by just kind of laying the groundwork of what I think these hearings have done, what we've gotten out of them, and what we can expect in the future, now that we know that there may be further hearings from this committee in the fall. So one of the things that I've heard as a criticism of the January 6th committee hearings, especially in the beginning, like after some of the earlier hearings in June, was that, this was like a made for TV endeavor, and that it wasn't a serious investigation about getting to the root of what happened. And I really disagree with that. I think that what we've seen as the hearings have gone on is that is very far from the truth. The way that the hearings have shaped up, we've seen the committee laying out the case for criminal violations, even though they began this by saying, we're not criminal prosecutors, that's not our role here. We've heard a lot of references to criminal law, but also testimony from witnesses that I think is really relevant to these parallel criminal investigations that are going on in states and at the federal level. I think we've also heard evidence that is really important for civil violations. I'll talk a little bit about the civil lawsuit that we brought here in Wisconsin. And I think at the core, the hearings have really shown the culpability of the folks involved. And, that's a different question than criminal convictions or anything like that. But I think showing the intent of some of the bad actors here it is, I think, an incredibly important piece of what the hearings have done for the broader audience. So I think the substance of the hearings and the ability to clearly lay out the truth that the American people deserve has been central to these hearings, and we've seen that evidence time and time again. They've presented new information, previously unknown facts, including about our own senator from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson. And the most important thing that I think the committee has done is really show to the American people that this was not a one-day event, right? This is the January 6th committee, but what we've seen from the evidence and testimony is that this wasn't simply something that got out of control. The plans for this resistance to the peaceful transition of power began even before Election Day. And we saw months and weeks of planning that led up to what we saw playing out at the Capitol on January 6th. And we learned about the repeated attempts by those in the former president's circle to warn against this, to try to talk him out of this. And the witness testimony on that, I think, has been very compelling, that there were people who had the president's ear speaking up against some of these attempts to undermine our democracy and to promote violence. And what happened is those people were just pushed out of the president's circle, and that inner circle got smaller and smaller because there were people on the inside trying to denounce this. So I think that is really key from what we've seen from the hearings. And this new information, again, that we've seen, whether or not it leads to criminal charges or civil suits, in the long term in these other investigations, because of course it's not the January 6th committee's job to put on criminal trials or anything like that. I think that this new information is so important either way, because the American people deserve the truth. They deserve to know what happened with this really unprecedented attack on our government, on our democracy. And it's so important that we are able to take these facts and learn from this history in order to safeguard our democracy and shore it up for the future. I think two of the biggest themes that I really want to hold in our discussion today are about accountability for bad actors, but also the future. These hearings are not about the past. Sure, they're about what happened on January 6th. Sure, they're about what happened in the weeks and months leading up to that. But really what they're about is the future of our democracy in America and here in Wisconsin, quite frankly. So when we're thinking about, what should come from these hearings, what the purpose is, what the next steps are, I think it's crucially important that we remember that this is about our future, and that should guide the actions that we take and that people who are pursuing accountability around the country take. So I'll pivot really briefly to Wisconsin and why I think these hearings are so important, and the revelations from the hearings are so important for our state in particular. The first, I think, almost goes without saying, which is Wisconsin is a swing state, and we're going to continue to be a swing state because we are a relatively purple group of people, and the way we vote across the state. Our presidential elections are likely going to continue to be close. And maybe they don't need to be particularly close for the events that led up to January 6th and that to happen. But I think that here in our state, we really, there's a particular danger that means that Wisconsin needs to focus on preventing things like this from recurring in the future, even more so than other states. So let's talk about why that is and some of the events that I think point to that. So Wisconsin was one of 7 states where fake presidential elector votes were cast and transmitted to Congress, claiming that Donald Trump won the state's electoral college votes when he in fact lost the election in that state. So here in Wisconsin, when we go to the polls and vote on election day or on absentee ballots, we're marking a little bubble, right, that says I'm voting for Joe Biden or I'm voting for Donald Trump. But the way that the election actually works and how the Electoral College works is those votes are actually counted towards a slate of presidential electors. Wisconsin has had 10 Electoral College votes in this most recent election. So our votes for Joe Biden or Donald Trump are actually counted towards their slate of electors. Those electors, once they have won the statewide election, convene at our state capitol in early to mid-December on a date specified in state and federal law and cast the state's electoral college votes for president. Those votes are then counted by Congress on January 6th. As we saw, that's the vote tallying that was disrupted by the violent attack on the Capitol. So this kind of, really bureaucratic kind of function that I don't think a lot of people think about. I certainly didn't think about the Electoral College votes that much before January 6th happened. This function became really important for what happened and the former president's attempts to undermine the peaceful transition of power in our country. So in Wisconsin, 10 individuals who, 9 of whom would have been electors had President Donald Trump won the state in the 2020 election, and another individual, they got together on the date appointed by statute at the state capitol, out of sight of the public cameras and the reporting that was covering the real presidential electors. And these folks cast fake votes saying that they were the duly authorized and elected representatives for the state of Wisconsin for the Electoral College. They sent these fake votes off to Congress, to everywhere else that is required by the statute. And then what we saw on January 6th in the lead up was an attempt to use these fake votes from Wisconsin and other swing states to pressure Vice President Pence, who is overseeing Congress and the vote tallying at that point, to count these votes instead, or to throw out the votes from these states altogether and kind of throw the presidential election to the House or trigger these other kind of backup plans. One of the biggest pieces of evidence reviewed and testified about at the January 6th hearings was this memo by John Eastman kind of laying out how this plan with the alternate votes could help throw the election back to Donald Trump at the national level. So these votes were sent off to Congress, and these 10 individuals in Wisconsin so far have not faced any criminal or civil consequences for their participation in this. And we think that it is so important that they are held accountable because, the federal investigations, all of the things that are going on at the federal level, including the January 6th committee hearings, a lot of these are focused on the former president, on the lawyers who assisted him. But we have these folks here in Wisconsin who really disrupted our process, who appear to have very clearly broken Wisconsin state law. And they're, maybe smaller fish on the scale of the federal investigation, but they're deeply important here. And making sure that this doesn't happen again in Wisconsin should really be a focus of all of us who live here. So in May, Law Forward filed a civil lawsuit against these 10 individuals, the fake electors, as well as 2 lawyers who appear to have assisted them, Ken Chesborough and James Trupis, in their planning and in their actions. And we're seeking accountability and a clear declaration that this was unlawful and to make sure that this never happens again. Like I said, Wisconsin will likely continue to have close votes, but this is just not how our democracy is supposed to work, right? In America and in Wisconsin, everyone can and should campaign hard for the candidate that they think is best. But when the election is over, when the votes are counted, when the recount is over, when the post-election litigation is all over and has continued to confirm that one person won the election, we come together as Americans and celebrate a peaceful transition of power. That is Wisconsin values, that is American values, and that is how we keep our democracy functioning. These folks really threaten that here in our state. And as we saw with what happened at the tallying of these votes in Congress, threatened the outcome of the election at a national level in a very real way. So while there's been a lot of focus on the DC actors in the January 6th committee hearings, and I think that's entirely appropriate, there should be. Here in Wisconsin, we need to also make sure that these other people are held accountable. These are not random people who walked off the street on December 14th and decided, hey, we're going to cast votes for Donald Trump and pretend that they're Wisconsin's votes. These are people who hold positions of power in our state's government, in politics in our state. One of them, Robert Spindell, was and continues to be a commissioner on the Wisconsin Elections Commission. Andrew Hitt plays a role in several campaigns across the state. These are folks who influence what happens in power and in government in our state, and we need to make sure that they're held accountable for those actions. So while I don't have many updates that I can share about the civil suit because it was just filed in May, I do want to just touch briefly on the fact that this would be complementary to or apart from any sort of criminal action. We do believe that there were also criminal laws that were broken here in Wisconsin, and Law Forward, along with our partners at SEIU, has sent 2 letters to the district attorney here in Dane County, who would have jurisdiction over the capital area, about what we believe are the criminal violations, what we see as the criminal laws that were broken, calling his issues to his attention. We've seen criminal charges and a grand jury move forward in Fulton County, Georgia, and I think that sort of action is appropriate here. So again, along with our partners at SEIU, we've been calling for that criminal investigation. The mayor of Madison recently joined us at a press conference to call for this criminal investigation and charges as appropriate. So our civil suit, while I think it's important to use all the tools that we have for accountability, it certainly does not take the place of a federal investigation, of a local criminal investigation, or the other methods that we have available to us to seek accountability. So with that, I think I'd like to turn it over for questions. I see we've already had a couple things popping into the chat. Bonnie and Rhonda, I don't know if you want me to just kind of read them or if you want to moderate, but I'm happy to do whatever you'd like.
Well, the first question we have, and please continue to put any questions in the chat, is asking about the violence we saw at the Capitol compared to what we saw in the summer following the murder of George Floyd.
Mm-hmm. So look, I think that peaceful protest plays a very important role in American politics, and we have a long history in this country of people standing up for what is right. What we've never seen before is an attack on our national capital by a violent mob like this. And I would think that it's also incredibly important to remember what was going on in that building, what they were trying to disrupt. Right? This was not an attempt to damage the property that is the Capitol building. I know that a lot has been made of the photos of people like carrying off, a podium and things like that. To me, that's not this core of this. This is not, oh, there was property damage to what I imagine is a very expensive building and things in it. These folks were trying to disrupt literally the peaceful transition of power in our country, the system that we use for officially selecting the next president and leader of our nation. This has absolutely never happened before. This was a violent attempt to destroy our American democracy. And like I said, in America and in Wisconsin, certainly, we have our political disagreements. We have our differences of opinion, and we all can and should campaign and fight hard for the things that we believe in. But again, when the votes are counted, we have all agreed that this is our system, and we need to come together, whether the candidate we won, that we liked won or not, and participate in that peaceful transition of power, because that is how we continue to move our country forward. And violent attempts to overthrow our government, our democracy, are absolutely not what this country stands for.
Thank you for that. And then a comment of appreciation for everything that Law Forward does. And then asking if you would comment and predict, if you feel comfortable, about the chances and, more importantly, the process for achieving bipartisan support from legislators for democracy in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so this is an incredibly important question, and I will do my best to predict the future here. But here's what I will say. One of the reasons that that I think starting Law Forward was so important, and one of the reasons that our first really big litigation undertaking was redistricting, is because democracy has really been under attack and been eroded for at least the last decade here in our state. And that is starting to show up and pay dividends in all of these other areas that we're seeing right now. So it is incredibly difficult to pass the sort of reforms that we might think are appropriate to shore up our democracy in the legislature right now, because it is so gerrymandered. The folks who are elected right now are largely not accountable to their voters in the way that they're supposed to be, in the way that the system was set up to make sure that they are. By living under this extreme partisan gerrymander in Wisconsin for the last 10 years, we've seen people driven further to partisan extremes for sure, but we've also seen folks just not care what their voters think and voting on party lines, not voting to represent individual views or the views of their constituents. I think there are a couple of really good examples of this, but really nothing is more prominent to me than the response or lack of response to the COVID-19 pandemic. People across Wisconsin agreed that we needed action. We needed support from our government. Things needed to be changed to deal with the emergency situation and to make sure that families could stay safe and healthy across our state. And we simply didn't get that from the legislature. We got months and months and months of inaction. And then we got the legislature litigating instead of legislating to try to prevent actions that were being taken by the executive branch. And that's not something that the people of Wisconsin wanted. And that's reflected in polling, but I think also, I'm sure, just conversations that you've had with your neighbors and friends and family across the political spectrum. And we might not always agree what the solutions are or the appropriate way of dealing with these, but we really saw the legislature not attempt to do anything to fix this. And that is really because this current legislature is so gerrymandered that I think it is largely unaccountable. Now, we just went through another round of redistricting. We had a chance to fix that, to make our maps a little bit fairer. And unfortunately, the Wisconsin Supreme Court really declined to do that. We have maps now that are even more partisan gerrymandered than what we've been living under for the past 10 years. And we really need to fix that, to fix this fundamental issue of our democracy in order to get legislation that we need moved through that body here in Wisconsin. And this, I think, really goes to kind of a larger theme that the January 6th attack on the Capitol is an extreme example of too, which is this super minority of folks who are attempting to hold on to and consolidate power in Wisconsin and in our country. They hold unpopular views that most of America does not agree with on everything from reproductive rights to gun safety to racial justice to voting rights. But I think that the facade that these views are actually winning in our political discourse and people are getting elected because they have these unpopular views, that's really starting to crumble because we're seeing more and more extreme measures have to be taken by these folks to hold on to that power. And our partisan gerrymandering in our state is an example of it, of really fixing the rules of the game when you can't win fairly. And the January 6th, the attack that turned violent, is a really extreme example of what some folks in our country are willing to do to hang on to power despite having views that most Americans don't agree with and support. And when it comes to issues of our democracy in particular, to me, it's very obvious why the folks who hold on to this super minority power went after voting rights first, because they knew that these views are unpopular, right? So in Wisconsin, we saw restrictions on voting, including like voter ID laws passed several years ago, and that predates the really violent attack on reproductive rights that we're seeing right now. And I think that is intentional, that is very clear, and it's because folks knew that they had to restrict people's right to participate in our democracy in order to enact these unpopular policies. Because most of Americans agree that abortion should be safe and legal and available to people who need it. But the folks in power want to enact these unpopular views. So again, voting rights are the bedrock here, and these issues with our democracy really ladder up to everything else that we care about.
Thank you. And then there's one more question about Law Forward specifically, which is how is the public's response to Law Forward's actions and status? And how much of what you're doing affects those who are undecided or those who are on the moderate side of our parties?
Yeah, so I want to start by just saying it has been tremendous, the reception that this organization has received and the support, and I'm so grateful. I know that all of you on this call, so many of you are a big part of that, and we're grateful for your help and your support, really across the board, across so many things that we've done. The welcome that the organization has received has been tremendous. A lot of our individual supporters, as well as the organizations that we partner with, have expressed this need for this legal organization doing pro-democracy work in our state. And we're nonpartisan, right? We do not, pick sides in elections. We're not Democrats or Republicans. We share a progressive vision for what our state can be, and certainly we all staunchly support a functioning democracy in our state. But that means that we talk to people across the party divide, right? And I am heartened by the level of agreement and support that we've gotten from folks, really across the political spectrum, recognizing the need for this work. Not everyone is always going to be willing to speak out publicly about some of these issues, right? But the number of folks who've told me, just kind of personally how much they appreciate this work and how much they see a need for it because of where Wisconsin is right now, has been very heartening to me.
All right, and thank you. Rabbi Bonnie has a question for you.
Mel, thank you so much. This has just been tremendous. There was a report that just came out in the Washington Post today that Ginny Thomas, wife of Justice Clarence Thomas, sent emails to Arizona and to Wisconsin, to Kathy Bernier and another legislator, asking them basically to vacate the electors and to basically appoint the president. Her legal team's pushback is she was just exercising her First Amendment rights to express her opinion. We haven't heard her testimony yet, and this is a little bit of crystal ball gazing, but I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts about possible criminality, the likelihood of her actually appearing before the hearings. Just kind of wanted to get your reactions to this news.
Yeah, well, I think it raises an important point that I probably should have made earlier, which is when I say that January 6th wasn't just a one-day event, I think I talked a little bit about what led up to it and what we've learned about what was going on leading up to it and laying the groundwork. And I should have also mentioned what's been happening since. These continued attempts to decertify the election in Wisconsin, which is of course not a thing, and I know has played out in other states as well, but we've seen just months and honestly years of attempts to score political points by members of the legislature and others by continuing to push this issue, continuing to try to relitigate the 2020 election, despite the fact that it was, counted, recounted, litigated, and decided all before the fake electors even met in December of 2020. We've seen these continued attempts that I think are incredibly damaging to our democracy and are very obviously attempts to disenfranchise people by discouraging them about our democracy, about the value of their vote in Wisconsin. And of course, if your vote didn't have value, they wouldn't try to dissuade you from voting so much. I think that's really important to remember, but the so-called investigation by Michael Gableman into the election, all of these ongoing attempts are really part of this same effort. And I think all part of the attempts to erode our democracy in ways that are continuously damaging. The communications from Ginny Thomas, I think in some ways, we should not overlook the importance of them. She's obviously an important national figure in many ways. But I also think that viewing them in isolation as this letter or the text that she sent or something like that is a mistake, and that we should be viewing this as a broader effort by many people, and that we should hold the folks that broke the law here in Wisconsin accountable, and the folks that broke the law nationally accountable. I think that there's a place for federal investigations as well as state-based investigations, as well as civil suits, and all those tools need to be wielded appropriately to make sure that this doesn't happen again in the future. As far as attempts to continue to decertify the election in Wisconsin or to throw this issue back to the legislature, that's not something that there is a legal path to do in our state. For good reason, right? In Wisconsin, and just like in the rest of America, voters decide, and voters decided the outcome of this election. So that continues to be important, but we shouldn't ignore the ongoing attempts to erode our democracy through changing legislation, through disbanding the Wisconsin Elections Commission and putting that power in a partisan elected official. We need to continue to stay vigilant, whether they're attacks on democracy from outside Wisconsin or from within.
Well, I see that there aren't any questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask something that has bothered me for a while, which is, these bad actors, whether they're national figures or figures right here in Wisconsin, do we view them as people who really thought they were doing was right, or do we view them as manipulators of a system that they felt they could corrupt?
So I want to speak to the 10 fake electors in Wisconsin specifically. I think we've seen a more complicated story roll out at the January 6th committee hearings about some of the people, including some of the former president's advisors, who got so far in this and then started having second thoughts, realizing what was going on, realizing how wrong it was. And those are the folks who, of course, the committee was able to secure testimony from, right? And I should say, not just the president's advisors. We saw folks who got swept up in, the Proud Boys and other organizations like that were on the ground on January 6th, who came to regret their role in that and shared that with the committee. But for the 10 fake electors here in Wisconsin, obviously I'm not them. I don't know what is on the inside of their minds, but what we do know, what is publicly available information to all of us, is that in Wisconsin, not only was the election over by the time these individuals met and cast these fake votes, the count had concluded, the votes were certified, the Supreme Court, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the highest court in our state, had ended the litigation challenging the recount, which is the only way to challenge the outcome of the election under our state statutes. That litigation was over. The Supreme Court and our state actually, I maybe don't always give them the credit that they deserve, but they moved incredibly quickly to make sure that this litigation was concluded and that Wisconsinites had clear and final answers on the outcome of our election before the Electoral College votes needed to be cast. So they issued an opinion earlier that day, the day that the Electoral College was scheduled to meet, ending that recount litigation. We know from publicly available reports by one of the fraudulent electors that that group had heard about the Supreme Court's decision and was disappointed by it before they gathered in the Capitol and cast those votes. So that's the publicly available evidence that we have at this point. It's possible that we'll learn more as the lawsuit proceeds. It's possible that there will be testimony from these individuals about, what they themselves were thinking at the time. But I think the publicly available evidence right now is very obvious and speaks for itself about the fact that there was no doubt who had won the state of Wisconsin when these folks gathered and cast these votes.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking, I see there's no more questions in the chat. I don't know how much more you had to cover, Mel. We have a little bit more time if you'd like.
Yeah. So I'd be
Mel,
happy.
if I could, I have a question. If I may, and
Please.
good to see you, Mel. I'm curious as to whether DA Ozane has decided yet or sent you a response to your request that criminal charges be filed against the fake electors.
So no, we have not heard anything conclusive from the Dane County DA's office about pursuing this. Now, again, I want to be very clear. It's possible that, there is an ongoing investigation and that it's just not something that they're making public. And, I respect that their office is very, very busy and, like many of our government agencies, likely understaffed. So I don't want to get too far over my skis speaking for them, but no, we have not heard anything conclusively. Law Forward and our friends at SEIU sent a letter to his office in February, kind of outlining what we thought were the likely criminal violations here that we believe deserved investigation. And we followed up on that letter last month and then held a press conference with the mayor of Madison, kind of calling for action, calling for an investigation of these individuals and their ties to what played out across the country, but the actions that occurred specifically here in Dane County, which would obviously be the appropriate focus for that office. So we haven't heard anything. We continue to believe that an investigation is appropriate and that if charges are warranted, that they should be brought in order to deter this sort of action in the future in Wisconsin.
Well, I raise that in part because I think as some others may or may not know, and my burden was trying to teach some of this stuff to students over years, but Wisconsin has a mechanism that if the DA is unavailable or refuses to file charges when faced with evidence of criminal wrongdoing, that the law permits the appointment of a special prosecutor. I think the materials that you provided to the DA certainly make out a strong case to warrant, if not a prosecution, an investigation. And I'm wondering if one of the possibilities is to suggest that a long delay without explanation in itself is tantamount to a refusal, which would then allow the statute to be invoked to appoint a special prosecutor to consider whether or not charges should be brought.
Yes, absolutely. And this statute is one of the reasons that we asked the district attorney's office for a clear statement, right? If you're not going to investigate or pursue this, we would like to know so that we can have the option of bringing this to a judge to have an indictment issued separately. And, I will share this disclaimer, despite taking Professor Kempton's excellent criminal law class, I am not a criminal lawyer. This is not my foremost area of expertise, but I do think that this is a case where that could be appropriate. Again, this is a crime that really impacts everyone in Dane County and in the state of Wisconsin if this is indeed a criminal violation. So I think it is worth taking that incredibly seriously. And I think that we deserve to expect attention to something like this from our elected public officials who do serve the public. These actions occurred in Dane County, and if the DA here is not willing to pursue them, I do think that it is worth looking at this option of bringing it to a judge and asking for a special prosecutor.
Okay, thank you, Mel.
Thank you.
There is a question that as the news cycle moves so quickly, as we see, a question about the documents at Mar-a-Lago. And again, you just said you're not a criminal lawyer, but the question is, do you think there'll be prosecutions arising from the documents that were seized at Mar-a-Lago?
Yeah, I certainly think that that is developing, and it's something that many of my colleagues are paying a lot of attention to, folks who do have criminal law experience. This idea of the news cycle moving quickly, to me, this has been this experience with the fake presidential electors in Wisconsin has been a really interesting experience, in that when Law Forward first called for accountability for these folks in January of 2021, we did not receive an overwhelming level of interest, I would say. Folks kind of thought like, okay, they didn't succeed, it's fine. As more and more information has come out leading up to the January 6th hearings, and certainly through the hearings, we've seen a spike in interest about this, a spike in people in our state saying someone has to do something about this. So I think this has been a counterexample for me in the way that news cycles, normally move with people moving on, where this is something that people have come back to and recognize the importance of. And like I said, there are a lot of federal actors who have received a lot of attention, including the former president for his role in the January 6th attack, as well as potential other crimes, including what we've seen with the documents held at Mar-a-Lago. And I don't mean to diminish the importance of that attention by saying that we should focus on what's happening here in Wisconsin. But when I think about what those of us on the Zoom really have, power over, what we have the ability to bring our advocacy to bear on, I do think it's so important that we focus on our state and not just get swept up in some of the more dramatic revelations about the former president himself. While he certainly is a one-of-a-kind person, in almost every instance, everything that we've seen, he did not act alone, and that he couldn't have carried out the things that he did without the support of the people around him. And it's important that we all remember that when we are thinking about how we shore up our democracy.
Wow, thank you, Mel. That was a great way to conclude today by focusing on what was happening here in Wisconsin and our quest to keep democracy alive in our state and our country. Mel, I cannot personally thank you enough for this webinar. You clarified a lot of things that I was very confused about, and I want to personally thank you for your time today, and of course for everything that you and Law Forward do to promote democracy in our state. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this over back to Peter, who has a couple last things to say as well. Again, thank you so much, Mel.
Thank you for having me. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, obviously this is an evolving issue, like lots of the things that we work on here at Law Forward. So if you want to stay in the loop, please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, sign up for our emails. Things move fast, but we will do our very best to keep you informed about what's happening in Wisconsin.
Yeah, well, I want to add my thanks, Mel, as well. This has been very interesting, very illuminating, and thanks to everyone who joined today. At the beginning, I mentioned our Interfaith canvassing project, Pray with Your Feet, Pray with Your Vote. And I just want to note that this sort of an effort is very time and labor intensive. When we did it in the spring, Rhonda put in a lot of work, especially pulling it together, Bonnie as well. And, we're working, in order to carry this sort of a project off, we've been working with other organizations like the League of Women Voters and other groups to organize these teams around the state and to get them trained. And that takes money. We're also well, that's not the part that takes money. The part that takes money is we want to hire some organizers in these parts of the state where we're having this, where we don't, have a direct presence. And fortunately, an anonymous donor has pledged up to $3,500 in matching funds for this effort. So I really hope that those of you who are on this call or who are listening to it as a recording would use the link in the chat to make your donation today to this effort so that those donations will be matched and help ensure a strong voter turnout in November. And again, just to remind you, the chat also has some links if you're interested in volunteering for the canvassing or the Poll Chaplains project. But with that, I think it is time to just wrap this up. And again, thanks to everyone. And we are looking for, in response to a question in the chat, we are primarily looking for clergy to do the Poll Chaplain project, but anybody can do the canvassing project. So again, thanks everybody, and have a great afternoon and the rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.